Willow Springs, Illinois. Just a quiet on a map if you drove past with the windows up and the radio on. Brick bungalows with clipped lawns. A diner with coffee that never seemed to cool. Squad cars gliding by like cats that knew where the milk was kept. On paper, it was a postcard. In practice, it was a handshake with a shadow. The outfit had a seat at the table. Favors moved faster than stoplights. And if you asked too many questions, the answers had a way of going for a swim. That's where our story plants its first footprint. On the edge of a sanitary canal that cut through the industrial backlit like a dark zipper. The wind carried the smell of oil and river weed, and the water swallowed secrets whole. Locals said you could lose a decade out there. They weren't wrong. By the spring of 1982, 3 names held the town like a 3-finger grip. Michael Corbett, police chief, civic smile, the kind of handshake that lingered. James Jim Keating, Cook County Sheriff's Lieutenant, Vice Squad, a man who could count the minutes between a phone call and a patrol car arriving, if it arrived at all. And the third, an attorney with a rich client list and a richer rumor mill, Diane Masters. Masters didn't just talk to judges. He made the room tilt. Cases fell the way he nudged them, and the whisper said the nudge was never free. Masters had a wife, Diane, bright, civic-minded, the face you wanted at a ribbon cutting. She served on the Moraine Valley Community College Board, pushed for a shelter to keep battered women from going back to the door that hurt them. She smiled for cameras, and the town smiled back. But behind the curtains, brittle words, a controlling husband, a plan to file for divorce that moved like a secret note from pocket to pocket. One night, after a college board meeting, Diane never came home. The first knock on the master's door came with badges and polite voices. Cook County officers asking the routine questions that never feel routine. Alan told him his wife had been out late with colleagues, called around, worried, waited by the phone. He was calm, composed, helpful, and then suddenly impatient. A lieutenant tried to widen the search inside the house, but another officer stepped in, firm, dismissive. Time to go. Let the man breathe. It was a strange moment that smelled like burnt toast. Something was wrong, but you couldn't see the flames yet. The case surfaced in the local press. Missing spouse, community figure, heartfelt pleas. Friends told a different kind of story. A husband who tracked her movements. A marriage damp with fear. Diana confided in a professor she was seeing. A quiet romance trying to grow in the shade. That, too, would matter later. While county detectives stumbled to the front yard version of events, another investigation, separate, colder, disciplined, was already lacing up its boots. The FBI, by then long acquainted with Chicago's underside, was running an undercover operation aimed at the outfit's suburban revenue stream. Topless clubs that sold more than neon, and credit card laundries that could turn a night of cash and vice into a clean receipt for limousine service or catered meals. The Bureau had placed an undercover asset where the accounts went to WASH, National Credit Service, a bland office with unbland clientele. The agent wore a merchant's grin and an alias that opened doors. Larry Wright. Wright, real name Special Agent Larry Dameron, shook hands with club owners who knew their way around a back room. He learned which doors were for customers, which for arrangements, and which for the people you never wanted to surprise. Money traveled. Fees shaved off like curls of wood, and every pass of the blade paid for silence. When the new betting parlor needed air cover, Dameron was introduced to the man who granted it, Chief Michael Corbett of Willow Springs. The message delivered with the casual tone of a weather report. Nothing opens in this village unless Corbett opens it. The Bureau played the long game. They collected tape, timing tone. Who called whom? Who expected envelopes? Who could make a traffic stop evaporate or a citation never arrive? And in the background, while hidden microphones listened to the commerce of compromise, the name Diane Masters began to reappear, first as a fixer, then as a fulcrum. Club owners mentioned him in lowered voices. Street talk granted him reach. If favored outcomes were a currency, Masters had a mint. Meanwhile, Willow Springs tried to pretend it wasn't holding its breath. Diane's disappearance had worn the edges off every conversation. At the precinct, the new chief, James Ross, a straight arrow drafted to replace Corbett, answered to a different compass. He took calls directly. kept notes like a ledger, and understood that the fewer people who knew where he filed things, the safer those things were. Days turned, then weeks, and then, one night, a patrolman cruising the canal road noticed something small and strange. Ruts in the gravel pointing to the waterline, like twin pencil marks ending in a smudge. He called it in. Dawn brought more blue lights, then divers. The canal was a bad storyteller. It kept everything and it kept it quiet. By afternoon, a crane began lifting the past, steel bumper by steel bumper. One car, then another, a submerged graveyard of insurance give-ups. The kind of racket that pays twice. Once when the policy check's clear, again when the right cops look away. The third haul broke the air like a gasp. A yellow Cadillac rose in the canal, its trunk heavy, its windows filmed in silt. The plate, familiar. The key, in the ignition. The trunk, pried open by men who'd done this before and still spoke softly when they did it. Inside, what everyone feared and no one said aloud. A body. Dental records would confirm what the heart already knew. Diane. Time had frozen inside the car. The dash clock stopped 1:50. The watch on the body. Same minute. Same silence. The forensic people did what they always do. Measured, bagged, documented without shaking. 2 wounds to the face. Small bore entries along the cheekbone. Fragments later matched under glass. And a skull fracture that spoke of blunt force in a room with walls. The river had tried to scrape away what happened. Science put it back. From that moment, the center of gravity shifted. The county detectives, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, weren't alone anymore. The FBI folded the homicide into their larger map. What had been 2 stories, local corruption and a missing woman, became a single narrative with a spine. The Bureau's undercover team had already traced a diagram of the village's pressure points. Now the murder of Diane Masters cut through those lines like a scalpel. Special Agent Ivan Harris, methodical, unhurried, paired with a county homicide man who kept his eyes open and his circle tight. Evidence moved quietly to avoid friendly fire from unfriendly uniforms. Witness lists were redrawn. People who had been too nervous to talk found an outlet that felt safer. Federal offices with quiet hallways and working locks. The portrait of Diane sharpened. A colleague admitted she'd trailed Diane after a board meeting once. Curiosity and concern riding shotgun, only to watch her turn toward home. Friends recalled the bruising undertow of her marriage, the whispered plan to serve papers, the steadying presence of a professor who cared for her. The professor himself described phone calls that curdled mid-sentence, Diane checking on her dog, her husband suddenly on the line, his voice the wrong temperature. And in a cramped office miles in the canal, a private investigator slid a box of audio cassettes across the table. He'd been hired by Diane Masters to bug a home phone, jealousy masquerading as suspicion. He'd captured enough pillow talk to confirm the affair, and enough fury afterward to chill a room. Masters had allegedly vowed to end the problem, and to stage the ending so it looked like chance. Names surfaced, arrangements hinted at. The kind of talk that only becomes evidence when the right agency is listening and can line up the rest. Back in the Bureau's undercover world, Agent Dameron kept threading the needle. Corbett had been pushed out of his chair at the police department, but his Rolodex still worked. Keating, a lieutenant with seniority and a wider jurisdiction, stepped into the role of gatekeeper. Meetings in corner booths turned into quiet agreements. New club front could open, provided the envelopes arrived on schedule, and the operators remembered who kept the door unlocked. The FBI placed money, recorded conversations, let the tape roll until structured conspiracy revealed itself. Corbett for the streets and disposal, Keating for the county and hush, Masters for the courtroom and clean exits. Piece by piece, the mosaic took shape. Diane's fate wasn't a random gust. It was a planned weather event, and the only apparatus in reach big enough to map the entire storm, from backroom vice to bodies in the canal, was federal. The yellow Cadillac changed everything. Up until then, Diane Masters' absence was a story the town could fold into silence. A wife who left, a family misunderstanding, a matter for county detectives to file and forget. But once divers dragged her car from canal, silence wasn't an option. The press caught scent of the case like blood in water. Willow Springs, once a sleepy suburb, was now painted in headlines as a crooked stage where police, lawyers, and mobsters all shared the same script. Inside the Bureau's Chicago field office, Special Agent Ivan Harris studied the case file with a surgeon's patience. He'd already been piecing together the corruption network that kept vice clubs and betting parlors running without a hitch. Now, the corpse in the canal anchored the investigation to a human tragedy, one that combined all the other threads together into something federal prosecutors could swing at. Harris wasn't alone. Detective John Reed from Cook County was brought into the circle, handpicked for his caution and integrity. Reed was told plainly, trust no one wearing a local badge unless they were already in this room. Too many officers had their names whispered alongside Corbett's. Too many were rumored to be on Masters' payroll. From this moment forward, the Masters case wasn't just about murder. It was about a criminal enterprise shielded by the very men sworn to uphold the law. The Bureau didn't move loudly. They let others talk. Friends of Diane recall how she confided her fear, how she whispered about divorce, about an escape plan that never saw daylight. Her lover, Professor Jim Koselniak, confessed he too had felt the net closing. One night, after Diane called home from a bar, her husband's voice had answered instead of the babysitter's. Diane Masters had spoken with ice in his throat. Soon after, a stranger in a bar leaned too close to Koselniak, asked his name, asked if he knew Diane. No introduction, no explanation, just a threat disguised as curiosity. Later, Koselniak would identify that man as Lieutenant James Keating, the same Keating who was now surfacing in FBI recordings as a facilitator of arrangements. The portrait darkened. Diane wasn't just a casualty of domestic strife. She had stepped into the slipstream of organized crime, and her husband had friends who specialized in cleaning up problems. Then came Ted Nikaza, a private investigator once hired by Alan Masters himself. Nikaza admitted he planted a wiretap on the Masters' home phone at Alan's request. The tapes he collected exposed Diane's affair with Koselniak, and after playing incriminating audio for Alan, Nikaza remembered the attorney's words clear as broken glass. Diane had to be removed, not as a sudden rage, but as a plan. Masters allegedly spoke of Keating, of disguising murder as an accident, of knowing the right people to make the paperwork look tidy. For the Bureau, this was a revelation. Here was a bridge between pillow talk and conspiracy. But proof was still thin. A body in a trunk could suggest many things. To make this federal, to pull Corbett, Keating, and Masters under the same roof of prosecution, the FBI needed a structure, a pattern of behavior that transformed isolated crimes into a racketeering enterprise. That meant following every payment, every bribe, every shadowy favor until the whole operation looked less like a string of coincidences and more like a syndicate. So the Bureau tightened the net. Agent Larry Dameron, still undercover as Larry Wright, kept meeting with club owners and mob associates. His legend as a businessman laundering credit transactions gave him credibility, and more importantly, access. When he sat across from Keating in dimly lit restaurants, the lieutenant spoke like a man who owned his jurisdiction. No move was too small, no favor too large, provided he approved it. And always, his conversations looped back to a single name, Masters. If a license needed greasing, if a permit had to pass, if a case in court needed to vanish, Masters was a fixer. At one meeting, Keating chuckled when Diane's name surfaced. He remarked, almost casually, that her disappearance had been convenient, coming just a day before she was set to file divorce papers. Dameron didn't push. In undercover work, pressing too hard can close doors forever, but the Bureau's microphones captured every syllable. Later, prosecutors would replay that chuckle again and again, knowing it was as damning as any gun. Meanwhile, back at the canal, Chief James Ross, Corbett's replacement, had made a grim discovery. Divers hadn't just pulled Diane's Cadillac. They uncovered an underwater graveyard, dozens of cars dumped for insurance scams, each one a testament to years of sanctioned lawlessness. For Ross, it was confirmation that his department had been rotted from within. For the Bureau, it was leverage. Every crooked claim, every false report could now be traced to men who looked the other way. The FBI's blueprint was becoming clear. Corbett had controlled the village. Keating had extended protection across the county, and Masters had sealed deals in courtrooms. 3 men, 3 tiers of influence. Together, they weren't just corrupt, they were a criminal organization, a miniature mafia hiding under the respectable veneer of law and order. But the Bureau still needed the missing link, the direct tie between Diane's murder and this wider network of corruption. Rumors and tapes could suggest complicity, but federal court demanded something sharper. That's when another voice entered the room, a deputy willing to unburden himself, and with a confession, the picture sharpened into focus. The Bureau had been waiting for a break, something stronger than rumor, sharper than innuendo. It arrived in the form of a deputy, Jack Buckland. He wasn't the kind of man who usually cracked. His uniform carried years of service, but the rot around him had grown too heavy. When he finally sat across from Agent Ivan Harris, the air shifted. Buckland's story was the missing hinge. He claimed Lieutenant James Keating had approached him quietly, deliberately, as if recruiting him for a side job. The task was blunt. Stalk Diane Masters and her life, make her vanish. The price on the table, $25,000. To sweeten the arrangement, Keating assured Buckland that Police Chief Corbett would handle the cleanup. The body, the car, the disappearance. All Buckland had to do was pull the trigger. The deputy refused. But his testimony delivered something the Bureau could use. A direct solicitation. A plotted conspiracy with names and roles attached. It transformed Diane's killing from a tragic mystery into a federal racketeering charge. Murder here was not just a crime of passion. It was the ultimate transaction of a criminal enterprise. From there, the Bureau and prosecutors began assembling the likely sequence of events, the grim choreography of Diane's last night. On the evening she vanished, Diane returned home after a late board meeting. Inside the house, Alan Masters waited. He had been preparing his alibi, dialing long-distance numbers so phone records would place him at home, a dutiful father caring for his daughter. But when Diane stepped through the door, his careful plan cracked. She was never supposed to arrive. What happened next was reconstructed from fragments, physical evidence, confessions, and inference. Diane began to undress for the night. Masters struck her with a blunt instrument, twice to the head. The blows left fractures later confirmed by forensic pathologists. He then called Corbett, the chief who owed him more than one favor. Corbett arrived with an accomplice, helped carry Diane's body to her Cadillac, and drove into the night with another vehicle trailing behind. Masters stayed home, tethered to his phone calls, while his partners handled the disposal. By the time the Cadillac reached the sanitary canal, Diane was already gone. To obscure the timeline, the killers reset her wristwatch and the car's dashboard clock to 1:50 a.m., a detail meant to mislead investigators should the body ever resurface. 2 small-caliber rounds were then fired into her face, the final punctuation to a plan already written. The car was rolled into the black water, swallowed among dozens of others resting on the canal bed. The current would hide it for months, maybe forever. That was the hope. But secrets rarely stay buried. And when divers lifted that yellow Cadillac into daylight, the entire machinery of deception began to collapse. The Bureau pressed harder. Every tape agent Dameron had captured undercover was replayed, dissected, cataloged. Keating's offhand remark about Diane's disappearance being convenient. Masters' reputation for bribing judges to bend trials. Corbett's confessed willingness to look the other way. And now, Buckland's testimony tying them all to a murder-for-hire plot. The picture was undeniable. Masters had orchestrated his wife's death, leveraging the very officers who should have protected her. Corbett and Keating weren't bystanders. They were accomplices, guardians of a system where the badge was just another tool for profit. Prosecutors began fitting the evidence into a framework of RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was no longer 3 men committing scattered crimes. It was an enterprise, bribery, extortion, obstruction, and, at its bloody center, the homicide of Diane Masters. Still, the Bureau knew cases like this don't collapse overnight. They required patience, layers of corroboration, witnesses who could withstand cross-examination. And while they built the mosaic, Washington whispered pressure. The undercover sting was drawing attention. Leaks were possible. The clock was ticking. By 1985, the Bureau's case had grown teeth. Years of patient undercover work, club raids, wiretaps, envelopes passed hand to hand, had filled file cabinets with evidence. Now, with Diane Masters' body recovered and testimony pointing to a murder for hire, agents had the leverage they needed to move from whispers to indictments. But first, the sting had to be closed. Word had leaked to press. Rumors in Washington suggested journalists were circling, ready to expose the Bureau's ongoing operation in Willow Springs. If that happened, everything collected so far could wither in court. Supervisors in Chicago made a difficult call, and the sting fast, strike while the evidence was fresh, and lock down as many guilty men as possible. In the early hours of dawn, the FBI rolled out in force. Several hundred federal agents, backed by state police, hit more than a dozen nightclubs across suburban Cook County. Doors were kicked in, ledgers seized. Phones yanked from walls still warm from late-night calls. Owners were cuffed, bartenders scattered, and hidden rooms gave up boxes of receipts. Each one a ledger of vice and payoffs. Among those arrested were Joseph Mara, a club operator who served as a bridge between the outfit and the corrupt cops, and the Spilatro brothers, names already notorious in Chicago for their violent sway in Las Vegas and beyond. Alongside them, several officers from the Cook County Sheriff's Department and Willow Springs' own police force were led away in handcuffs. These were men who once flashed badges like shields. Now they were suspects, their protection rackets laid bare. For the Bureau, it was a crescendo. Special Agent Larry Dameron, who had lived undercover as Larry Wright for 3 long years, finally stepped out of his role. He described the end as elation and disappointment. Elation because the operation had exposed corruption in its raw form. Disappointment because he knew more secrets still lay in the dark. Yet the tapes, the transcripts, the confessions, they were enough. The sting had done its job. But the central question remained unanswered. Who killed Diane Masters? Now that the sting was complete, federal prosecutors could fully merge the murder with a larger racketeering case. Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Scorza, alongside his team, began drawing the lines in court filings. Alan Masters wasn't just a corrupt lawyer pocketing bribes. He was a man who had plotted his wife's death to protect his empire and to profit from her life insurance. Michael Corbett wasn't just a compromised police chief. He was a man who personally drove the Cadillac, containing Diane's body, into the canal. And James Keating wasn't simply a facilitator of vice. He was a lieutenant who offered up a deputy to pull the trigger when Masters demanded his wife be silenced. The evidence was damning but fragile. Prosecutors knew they could not prove the exact trigger puller beyond doubt. What they could prove was conspiracy, an enterprise that had planned, solicited, and covered up Diane's killing as one more transaction in a web of organized crime. Under RICO, conspiracy carried just as much weight. The Bureau tightened its circle around witnesses. Diane's colleagues confirmed her fear of Alan and her plans for divorce. Koselniak, the professor, testified about threats from Keating. The private investigator, Nikaza, delivered the chilling tapes of Diane's intimate calls and Alan's fury afterward. And Buckland's account of being approached for a hit sealed the narrative that Diane's death was no accident. As prosecutors built their story, they began to see how everything fit. Bribery, extortion, insurance fraud, prostitution, gambling, and at the dark heart, the murder of a woman who had stood in the way of Alan Masters' control. The press, once focused on topless bars and crooked cops, now splashed Diane's face across the front page. Her story, community leader, advocate for battered women, silenced by her own husband, turned the case from another corruption trial into a human tragedy the public could not ignore. Inside the FBI, agents knew they had cracked something bigger than one murder. They had exposed the system. And though the trial still lay ahead, the 3 pillars of that system, Masters, Corbett, Keating, were now standing on quicksand. By the summer of 1988, the Bureau's slow burn had reached its ignition point. 3 names, Masters, Corbett, Keating, were no longer whispered in back rooms. They were printed in indictments. Racketeering, bribery, conspiracy to commit murder, and mail fraud for the insurance claim Alan had filed on his dead wife. Federal charges, heavy enough to end lives in prison cells. The first domino to fall was Michael Corbett, the former Willow Springs police chief. Agents closed in, and under interrogation, he broke. Partially. He admitted he had been the one to sink Diane's Cadillac into canal. But when pressed about her body in the trunk, he feigned ignorance. Corbett wanted to confess just enough to soften the fall, never enough to sink himself completely. Yet his admission was crucial. It placed him at the very heart of the cover-up. Next came Lieutenant James Keating, once feared as an untouchable power broker in Cook County's vice world. He too denied knowing anything about Diane's fate, but the Bureau had already wired his voice into their case. That one offhand remark, chuckling about Diane's disappearance being convenient, now hung around his neck like a noose. Finally, the net closed on Diane Masters. The polished attorney who once sat in courtrooms bending outcomes with a glance was now seated at the defendant's table. Unlike the others, his charges stretched even further. Prosecutors alleged he had not only orchestrated his wife's killing, but then coldly collected on her life insurance policy. To the government, that wasn't grief. It was fraud layered on murder. Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Scorza understood the stakes. A direct murder conviction was out of reach. No one could point to the exact moment Diane's life was taken. But federal law offered another weapon, RICO. If Scorza could prove Masters, Corbett, and Keating acted as an ongoing criminal enterprise, sharing profits, exchanging favors, protecting each other, then Diane's murder became part of a much larger tapestry of crime. The trial was a labyrinth of detail. Jurors listened to months of testimony. Professors speaking of Diane's whispered fears, friends describing her bruises and her courage, investigators recounting how the Cadillac emerged from Blackwater with a broken watch still ticking silence. They heard the private investigator, Ted Nakaza, replay tapes of Diane's phone calls and Allen's rage. They listened as Deputy Buckland described Keating's cold offer to kill Diane for $25,000. Every fragment was a shard of glass. Alone, none could cut deep. Together, they formed a mosaic sharp enough to bleed. Prosecutors presented Diane's insurance policy, pointing out its cruel clause. Coverage only applied if a board member died traveling to or from a meeting. Masters had filed a claim insisting Diane never made a home, attempting to cash in before her body was even found. To the jury, that sounded less like grief and more like calculation. The defense painted another picture. Coincidences, rumors, misunderstandings. They argued Diane was a tragic victim of chance. Her husband guilty of flaws, but not murder. But as the trial wore on, the defense's brushstrokes blurred. The government's narrative, corruption flowing from a village police chief to a county lieutenant to a powerful lawyer who could twist the courts themselves, was too precise to ignore. Finally, the jury returned. Diane Masters, guilty on all counts. Racketeering, conspiracy, bribery, and mail fraud tied to Diane's death. 40 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. Michael Corbett, 20 years. James Keating, over 30. Scorza later reflected that the Masters case was never built on a single smoking gun. It was 1,000 small pieces, scattered across years, stitched together by the Bureau into a complete portrait. The jurors saw the picture, and once they did, they could not unsee it. For Willow Springs, the verdict felt like a cleansing storm. For the FBI, it was proof of method, patient undercover work, careful layering of evidence, and the willingness to chase corruption no matter how deep it ran. These were the tools that turned a missing persons report into a federal racketeering conviction. Yet, even as the courtroom emptied, one truth lingered in the air. Diane had been a woman trying to build a better community, silenced by the men who feared her independence. Her story had forced light into the darkest corners of a town, and the Bureau had made sure that light stayed on. The gavel had fallen, the sentences handed down, but the story of Diane Masters didn't end with the clatter of courtroom doors. In many ways, it began there, etched into the memory of a community that had once looked the other way, and in the annals of the FBI, which had turned a single woman's disappearance into a landmark case against entrenched corruption. For Willow Springs, the trial tore away a mask. Residents who once trusted their leaders, police chiefs, sheriff's lieutenants, respected attorneys, were forced to reckon with the truth. Their protectors had been predators. The local department, long a hollow institution propped up by favors and fear, was restructured. Federal oversight pressed in, and though scars remained, the old order was gone. Inside the Bureau, Agents viewed the case as proof of why patience matters. Special Agent Larry Dameron's undercover years had built the scaffolding. Ivan Harris's steady hand had kept the murder probe alive when it might have withered. Supervisors coordinated raids that snapped the spine of an organized network stretching from strip clubs to courthouses. Each detail, each tape, each reluctant witness, it all converged. And in the end, a jury saw what had once been hidden in plain sight. A conspiracy so brazen it wore uniforms and legal robes as camouflage. But the story also belonged to Diane. She wasn't merely a victim. She was a voice in her community, an advocate for those without one. She helped open a shelter for battered women, a place where others could escape the very cycle she herself could not. Friends remembered her as strong-willed, generous, unwilling to bend in silence. That strength made her a threat to Diane Masters, a man who measured control as power and sought to erase anything that loosened his grip. In trying to break free, she exposed his corruption, and for that he silenced her. Yet, in the cruelest irony, her murder lit the trail that dismantled his empire. The very thing Masters sought to bury became a stone that dragged him under. When the case closed, prosecutors and agents reflected on its mosaic-like nature. There was no singular revelation, no single confession that solved it all. It was 1,000 fragments, pieced together like shards of glass into a picture sharp enough to cut. A crooked chief, a dangerous lieutenant, a manipulative attorney, and a woman who wanted her freedom. Together, they told a story that only the full weight of the FBI could unravel. In the end, justice was measured not by the years written on sentencing papers, but by the truth that came to light. Diane's name, once spoken only in whispers of tragedy, became a reminder of why corruption can never be left unchecked, why federal agents chase shadows until they take form, and why silence is never the last word. The canals of Willow Springs still run dark, but they no longer hold Diane. Her story rose to the surface, and with it, the truth that toppled an empire of deceit.